We have a couple of very nice talks today. The first one is going to be on bingo, adaptivity and asynchrony in verifiable secret sharing and distributed key generation. And Gilad is going to give the talk.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear myself. All right. Hey, I'm Gilad Stern, and I'll be presenting bingo. I joined work with Itai Avraham, Philip Yovanovich, Mary Muller, and Sarah Michael John. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of general background. Many schemes and protocols rely on setup for structured randomness. So for example, I'm a consensus guy. The most efficient consensus protocols we currently know of need threshold signature schemes. And the efficient or the threshold signatures that are efficient in the way that we want need correlated keys. You can't just uniformly sample the keys independently. You need some correlation. Now, if you have a central authority that everybody trusts, then it can just generate those keys, give each party kind of a part of the key, and then you're done. Now, unfortunately, if you don't have that party, the parties need to do that setup themselves instead. We call this a distributed key generation protocol, DKG. That's a major thing that we're interested in this field. Now, note that DKGs kind of inherently imply consensus, so you have this chicken and egg thing. You want DKG for consensus, and you want consensus for DKG, so you need to solve this somehow. As a building block here, we're going to stop by an AVSS protocol, verifiable secret sharing, and VSS is just an important building block in general. You can construct all kinds of randomness generation protocols, like coin flipping and leader election and stuff of that sort. But also you can construct MPC protocols. You can either do that directly from VSS, or today modern protocols often do kind of some other pre-processing, like generating beaver triplets or something of that sort, and you often do that with VSS as well. We're going to consider asynchrony and adaptive security. We want to be resilient in highly adverse network conditions. So first, asynchrony. Often in cryptographic protocols, we assume that everything is synchronous. You have very clearly defined rounds. You know that everything happens in the first round before you continue the next round. And the world just isn't necessarily like that. You don't have like very clearly defined global rounds. So you want to be able to do stuff when that isn't the case. Sometimes the way you do that is by setting specific deltas, kind of saying, I know that a message will get delivered by some time. Then you have either the, you need to choose those deltas. If you choose too small a delta, then your protocol isn't going to be correct or secure. If you choose too large a delta, you're going to wait forever. You're going to wait for a long time because you're going to use that delta in your protocol. So we want to avoid that if we can. We also consider adaptive security. In an adaptively secure protocol, the adversary can choose which parties to corrupt as the protocol progresses. It doesn't have to choose them in the beginning. And that is hard both for construction and for proofs that adds a whole lot of difficulty in general. All right, so I'm going to jump into our main results and then take a step back and tell you what these results mean. So first, our first main result is bingo. Bingo is a packed AVSS protocol. By packed here, I mean that you get that you can share many secrets at the same time. It has the optimal corruption threshold of n greater than 3f. So by this I mean if you have f faulty parties and n total parties, n can be as small as 3f plus 1. This is optimal in the sense that if n is any smaller, or I guess f is any larger, just you can't construct such a protocol. This is like a very hard bound. The protocol is adaptively secure. It has a quadratic communication complexity for sharing n secrets, so a linear overhead per secret, and quadratic cost per single reconstruction. Now, if you just do the math, you can see that it's quadratic for n secrets, and reconstructing these secrets kind of naively, just one by one, is fairly expensive, right? It's cubic. Maybe the sharing is too efficient, or like it's too imbalanced in some way. So thankfully, we have all kinds of tricks for more efficient reconstruction. We can batch reconstruct everything at the same time for the cost of one reconstruction. We can also sum secrets and then reconstruct them, as opposed to first reconstructing them and then summing them. It's much more efficient. And again, it's for the same price. This protocol also shares the secrets along a single high-degree polynomial. This is helpful for all kinds of things, including our DKG. Our DKG, or ADKG, I guess, asynchronous DKG, is adaptively secure. It's an adaptively secure DKG for BLS. It allows for a high threshold setup, anything up to 2f+1 signing threshold. And it has an expected cubic number of words and constant number of rounds. Now, I have to have this expected there because we are in an asynchronous setting and we're kind of solving consensus in some way. So you can't do this deterministically. You need some probabilistic protocol. All right. What do we need in order to reconstruct our protocol? For Bingo, we use KZG. So that means we assume a KZG setup. That's an assumption as in of itself. Since we use KZG, we rely on QSDH. And we use the algebraic group model to prove an additional property of the commitment scheme. We think it's quite a natural property that is very desirable for a commitment scheme. For the DKG, we have all the previous assumptions, right? We need to use Bingo. And in addition, we use a proof technique by Julian Loss from last year to prove adaptive security, and that kind of involves the one more discrete log assumption as well. There's been a lot of recent work on DKGs and ADKGs, stuff of that sort. This is, if we're not mistaken, all the state of the art currently. First thing to note, as far as we know, we're the first adaptively secure protocol, or at least provably adaptively secure. That is, as I said, not trivial at all. In general, not trivial in an asynchronous setting. This is quite difficult to prove. And in addition, if you just look at the parameters, the numbers here, the best communication complexity is cubic, the best round complexity is constant, and the maximal threshold overall is 2f, and we're the only work that gets all these three things at the same time. Now, unfortunately, we have this trade-off. We rely on a setup, and that's quite a serious kind of thing that you might not want. So there's this trade-off here. All right, so now I'm going to go into kind of wildly hand-waving at definitions. I'm not going to give an actual definition. The paper includes actual definitions if you like them. I personally like them. For a packed AVSS scheme, it has two phases in a sense. It has a share phase and a reconstruct phase. In the share phase, you have a designated dealer, everybody knows, and the dealer gets a bunch of secrets. It's f+1 secrets in our construction. That's kind of what makes this packing. You get many secrets at the same time. Now, the dealer can input these secrets into the protocol if it wants. And if it does, all parties will eventually terminate and receive a done signal and terminate. Now, there are a few things to notice here. First, the only party that learns anything about the secrets is the dealer, right? It's the only one that saw anything. Secrets, everybody else only saw kind of a done signal. Now, in addition, if the dealer chooses to input something, everybody terminates, and if it doesn't, nobody terminates. There's this very kind of bimodal operation. If somebody terminates, we know that everybody will. And finally, it should be noted here also that once the dealer inputs some values into the protocol, if it chooses to do so, note that the dealer could be faulty, so it could choose not to do so. These values are binded. It shows these values and they're set in stone and it can't change its mind. Now that's important for the second part of the protocol, the reconstruction protocol. In the reconstruction protocol, parties can choose to reconstruct a specific secret, the kth secret, and if they do so, they will all receive the secret and output it from the protocol. Now, two things to note here again. This secret is the same secret that was binded in the first stage. When I say that the secrets are binding, I mean they're binding with respect to the reconstruction protocol. In addition, note that if that the parties only learn about the specific secret they reconstructed, and they don't learn anything about any of the other secrets this time. All right. So I'm going to go into the construction. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the tools we use, kind of how people have been doing VSS for a long time, and then show you Bingo. So the main tool we use is a bivariate polynomial commitment scheme. The bivariate polynomial commitment scheme is a scheme we construct based on univariate KZG. And in general, the way we commit to a bivariate polynomial phi, degree 2f in x and f in y, these are the degrees that we need, but you can generalize this. We just commit to many partial polynomials, phi xi for different i's, specifically for f plus 1 different i's. And if we commit to enough of these polynomials, this actually fully defines phi. Since y is the degree f, this is the number we specifically need. Now, thankfully, KZG has homomorphic commitments. This allows us to take these f plus 1 commitments and interpolate them in order to generate commitments to phi xj for whichever j we want, which allows us to open values very easily in any other kind of partial polynomial. Now, I've actually been kind of lying here. We're using a hiding variant of KZG, so there are additional kind of blinding factors everywhere. This is one thing, a small lie here. In addition, we actually do some pre-processing in order to help people, like different parties, not interpolate everything. It's kind of expensive, so this pre-processing means that we send a slightly different commitment, but morally, this is exactly what's going on. All right, so now I'm going to tell you about VSSs, how we classically do VSSs. When I mean here VSS, when I mean a classic VSS, I mean a non-asynchronous one necessarily, so possibly synchronous, not necessarily packing. So how do we do VSSs? A very common approach is to have the dealer who gets a single secret sample a bivariate polynomial of degree f by f and embed the secret in the free coefficient. Now, that means that phi 0, 0 is going to be, or one secret. Now, we don't actually have to embed the secret there. We can choose kind of wherever we want, pretty much wherever we want. This is a convenient place to put it. Then, well, often when working in this field, I think of these bivariate polynomials as kind of a matrix of size n plus 1 by n plus 1, with entries being the evaluations of the polynomial. So for example, the 0th row in the first column, you have the evaluation phi 1, 0. Right? And in general, in the ith row and jth column, you have the evaluation phi ji. Now, we don't have to think of these evaluations as kind of singular. We can think of them collectively. We can look at rows and columns of these of this matrix. So here, a row, if we look at the first row, it has evaluations of the form phi 0, 1, phi 1, 1, phi 2, 1, right? That's all evaluations of the partial polynomial phi x1. In general, the ith row kind of contains evaluations of phi xi. And the column is similar, just with y being the variable. And in classic VSS protocols, the dealer kind of provides the rows and columns to parties. Party I gets the ith row and ith column. And that's helpful for several reasons. The main reason this is helpful because these rows and columns intersect. So that allows parties to check for consistency. Right? The rows and columns at the points of intersection should be the same. And if you look, for example, at the first row and first column, the intersecting point is phi 1, 1, and it should be phi 1, 1 regardless of how we look at it, through the row or through the column. Now, in addition, parties can help each other if they didn't get rows and columns. So let's say we have a situation in which we have a faulty dealer. It sends everybody rows and columns with the exception of one party that didn't get anything. Now, if that's the case, it can ask other parties to help it, to give it the intersecting points. And once it receives enough of these intersecting points, it can interpolate the rows and columns and continue regularly as if it received those values from the dealer. Now, from this point on, you kind of need to choose how to reconstruct, how to terminate, but this is like a very basic kind of tool that we use in VSSs. So now I'm going to talk about bingo, our specific construction. In bingo, we have a dealer that gets f plus 1 secrets. We're a packing protocol. And that dealer samples a bivariate polynomial of degree 2f in x and f in y, such that the secrets lie on the 0th row. So the 0th secret is at phi 0, 0. The first secret is at phi negative 1, 0. The second is at phi negative 2, 0, and we continue kind of to the left if we think of the previous of the previous matrix. Now note that rows here are fairly long, they're of degree 2f, and columns are fairly short, they're of degree f. We're going to use this asymmetry. This idea of using an asymmetric degree is not new. Work by Patra Choudhury and Rangan from 2015 going to use this trick, and many other works follow that as well. We're also going to use this trick. The dealer then broadcasts a commitment to fee and sends every party its own column. Parties then send each other the intersecting points, and they actually don't do that to check for consistency. They do this for the second thing I talked about in the previous line, to help each other if they didn't get rows and columns. Then before terminating, every party makes sure that f+1 honest parties have their rows and columns. Now, an important thing to note here that when I say have their rows and columns, that doesn't mean they necessarily received it from the dealer. If I didn't receive anything, I might receive 1 point and another point, kind of slowly fill this out, my row or column. And once I get a full row and column, I can kind of yell bingo and start helping, kind of start sending parties points that intersect with their rows and columns and count myself as a party that received them. Then finally, to reconstruct a specific secret, the kth secret, you send just values along the negative kth column, and that's it. If you get enough of these values, you can reconstruct the full column, including the secret. So I'm going to talk, again, with hand waves about why this should work. In my opinion, the interesting kind of properties of VSS are the binding property. Once you kind of choose which values to input, they're binding. And the termination part that kind of says that if somebody terminates, everybody terminates. The other properties are important, but they're usually fairly straightforward. And these are usually the harder properties to prove. So first notice that consistency is immediately guaranteed by the commitment. You can't open the commitment at the same point to two different evaluations. You shouldn't be able to do that. So I'm kind of going to ignore consistency. For binding, we can say, first note that before terminating, you wait for f+1 honest parties to have their rows and columns. And if f+1 honest parties have their rows, these rows completely define all the short columns, right? The columns are degree f, and f+1 points on these columns kind of fully define them. And if you fully define all of the columns, you fully define the full polynomial. So it is enough to wait for this thing to happen to know that the full polynomial is defined, including the secrets. Termination uses this cascading effect. So again, if I wait for f+1 parties to have their rows, I know that they will help everybody get enough points on their respective columns. And if everybody gets points on their columns, everybody will get their rows. So I kind of have this effect that I know that if f+1 have rows, everybody will get columns, everybody will get rows, and at that point, I can terminate. Everybody will have both. All right, I'm going to move on to the asynchronous DKG. And that's it. So BLS, the threshold signature scheme, and other schemes as well, require all the secret keys to lie on a on a polynomial P, with the public keys just being the exponentiated secret keys. When I say lie on a polynomial P, I mean that Pi should equal Xi. So if we want to set up BLS, we kind of just need to collectively generate a random polynomial. So here's a classic approach to generating a random polynomial. You start off by having every party share a random polynomial. You then choose f+1 dealers who actually completed the share. And then you define P to be the sum of these shares. And since at least one of these dealers is non-faulty, the sum is going to be random because it actually input a random value. Now, we do this first step using bingo. We do the second step, the choosing f+1 dealers, using a consensus mechanism, a protocol by our same group from 2 years ago called No Waiting Hot Stuff. And in this protocol, we use bingo internally to generate randomness. Now, since bingo is adaptively secure and fairly efficient, we get efficient steps for both the first and second step. And now all we need to do is to reconstruct the exponentiated secret keys. And the way we do this is just by adapting KZG. That's it. All right, so in conclusion, our work presents bingo. Bingo is a packed VSS protocol. It is adaptively secure. It requires a quadratic number of words for sharing and quadratic number of words per reconstruction. And we construct an ADKG protocol for BLS that allows for a high threshold setup and has a cubic expected word complexity and constant round complexity. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you for the talk. So we have time for 2 questions. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I think actually I have one. So there is actually some recent work that achieves adaptive security in a certain sense with the same complexity, communication complexity, also with high thresholds. So I think it was at S&P 2022 or something. So what is the benefit of your protocol compared to that one?
I'm actually not sure. I don't remember. Do you remember
The round efficiency is like, I think they have log n round or something. Is that?
Oh, yeah. So
you
I first of all, I don't think they have a foolproof adaptive security when taking the final kind of result into account. I'm not sure. I think they don't have a foolproof, but there is this difference in round complexity. I think if you have a logarithmic round complexity, this one's going to take a little bit of time. And thankfully, we can get an expected constant round complexity, so it should be slightly faster, or ideally much faster, hopefully. Okay.
So, please.
Hi. So there's also some recent work in AVSS in 2021 that do solve high threshold AVSS with lambda n squared communication complexity. And it would be trivial if you have high threshold dual packed secret sharing. So I'm curious to see how does this compare with that AVSS?
Do you remember which one? Is it like the
it's Haven.
Haven
FC21?
Yeah. Again, I'm not sure if I'm not mistaken. That's one of our the works we compare ourselves to. I think they don't have. I think there are 2 differences. I think first of all, if I'm not mistaken, in order to achieve this quadratic complexity, they need more secrets. They need, if I'm not mistaken, they get this the best complexity once the number of secrets is on the order of n log n. Now, you can say, all right, no, then sorry, then I might just be wrong. I might be thinking of a different paper. But if I'm still not mistaken, I think they don't have a proof of adaptive security. I think, and that's the thing that we want. I need to take a look again. I might be mixing up Haven and like Honey Badger or one of these works. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again. We still can't see them. Okay, now, yeah. So the next talk is going to be on network agnostic security, comes almost for free in DKG and MPC, and Daniel Collins from EPFL is going to give the talk.
All right, great. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Daniel. This is joint work with Renas, Chenda, and Julian right here. So we're talking about network agnostic security for DKG. So Gilad already kind of motivated the problem to some extent, but in this talk, we consider sort of applications of, or setup rather, for threshold cryptography. So in threshold cryptography, we consider functionalities like threshold encryption or decryption, threshold signatures, and stuff like that. So the basic setting is that we have sort of a set of n parties up to which T are sort of malicious. We basically want to make sure that if T are malicious, then they learn nothing about sort of this, they can't do anything to affect the security of the signature scheme, for example. And so we want to basically deal with the setup for this. And so the way we solve this is using distributed key generation. So what specifically do we look at in distributed key generation in this talk? So we consider sort of a specific variant of distributed key generation, which like the talk we just saw, deals with sort of the sharing of a uniform field element associated with some group element. So firstly, here we want some kind of consistency requirement. So here we want all parties to agree on sort of some common public key. And moreover, we want each of those parties to be associated with some common, some vector of public key shares. So each party has some public key share. So what do these shares kind of correspond to? So this is where correctness comes in. So basically, this sort of says that sort of parties will agree on some kind of sort of that's encoded in the sort of secret and public material, some degree T polynomial, basically where the secret is the evaluation of that polynomial at 0. And then each party I, will have the basically the secret share for the point evaluated at like the index of that party, say I. And so basically, if you have T plus 1 of these points, you can join them together and compute stuff. And then for security, informally, we want something like sort of secrecy, where we say that somehow the adversary, given the public information, can't really learn anything about the secret that's been shared. And often we want the key to be uniform as well. Good. So why network? What is network agnostic security? So in the literature, we consider two main settings in the consensus work. And I'll say now that this is more of sort of a distributed talk. Thankfully, Gilad also already introduced some of the more crypto stuff. So here we consider a synchronous and an asynchronous network. So in a synchronous network, a message that is sent at some time t is sure to arrive at the other parties or whoever the message is sent to at time t plus delta for some known delta that everyone knows. In an asynchronous network, and so we assume that we have channels between parties that sort of are authenticated, and the adversary can't do anything about that. In the asynchronous network, however, what the adversary can do is limit the sort of the time it takes to send a message. And so different parties may receive the message at different points in time, but eventually they'll receive the messages sent. Good. So in the network agnostic setting, the problem really is sort of dealing with both of these settings, both of these networks at the same time. So in this setting, the network is either synchronous or asynchronous, but parties a priori don't know which world they're in. So let's look at sort of why that's interesting, because we already have synchronous and asynchronous protocols. So synchronous protocols, we know for DKG, tolerate a honest majority of corruptions. But as soon as you put them in an asynchronous network, relatively small amount of asynchrony can result in sort of, for example, consistency definitely being violated, and also security in general. Then we have asynchronous protocols. These, as we've seen, can tolerate up to 1/3 of corruptions. And of course, these work in a synchronous environment, but as soon as we don't get sort of a better threshold than that in synchrony. So in the network agnostic sort of line of work, the idea is to consider the best of these two worlds. And so here we consider thresholds that differ between the two settings, depending on whether you're in the synchronous or asynchronous setting. So here, if TA is the number of asynchronous faults, and TS is the number of faults when the parties are all in synchrony. And sort of firstly, we show that this sort of threshold is necessary and sufficient. So this means basically we can have a lot of faults in synchrony, but also have a few faults in asynchrony. So this can be useful in some situations. Let's do a quick calculation to see. So let FT be the probability there are more than T faults. And let P be the probability that the network delay exceeds delta. That is to say that the probability that the synchrony, the assumption is violated, let's say. So if we assume that the probabilities that the synchrony is violated is the same as the probability that the asynchronous threshold is exceeded, but then the probability that the synchronous threshold is exceeded is 0. And then we have the following. So firstly, we see that a synchronous protocol fails with probability 1/10, basically the probability that synchrony is exceeded. Then an asynchronous protocol will fail. It doesn't matter about the synchrony, but now it only matters about the number of faults. So then it's 1/10. But then in a network agnostic protocol, basically, if you need to either violate the synchronous number of faults and the synchronous bound, or you need to exceed the number of asynchronous faults if you're in asynchrony, if this has been violated. And this turns out to be, like in this calculation, to be much less. Good. So what model do we consider? So we consider a model where we basically want to compute a trusted setup for parties. So we don't want to assume a trusted setup, but in this work, we will assume a common reference string. And we assume a model where parties can upload their public keying material to some kind of publicly known bulletin board, let's say. And in particular, malicious parties can upload malicious keys. In this work, we only target static security, unlike the one before. And we basically say that the adversary, of course, can corrupt only TS in synchrony and TA in asynchrony, where that's the number of parties. So we're basically interested in making two claims, one about what the protocol behaves like in synchrony and the other in asynchrony, with these varying number of faults. Good. So what is the main contribution of this work? So the main contribution is that we consider this optimal threshold I talked about before. And then in this plain PKI setting, basically we construct a DKG that we show is secure, in synchrony/asynchrony, depending on the number of folds, with cubic communication complexity. And this, of course, matches the best in the literature in both settings. As an application of this, we get efficient network agnostic MPC without trusted setup. Such protocols have been proposed. We also do a little bit for MPC itself as well. Here's a quick comparison between the protocols. The last two in the slides here basically is the second last one is the talk we saw before, and this one is ours. So they have adaptive security, we have static, but we deal with fallback. So as we'll see, the protocol that we construct is divided into two broad components, a synchronous and an asynchronous component. So basically towards constructing our synchronous portion of the protocol, we introduce a new synchronous broadcast protocol. So this broadcast protocol deals with the dishonest majority of parties, but in any, so we don't need that per se for our setting, but in any case, we achieve sort of a nice communication complexity corresponding with the fact we don't need a trusted setup. So this may also be a independently interesting contribution. Good. So just quickly looking at the related work in the network agnostic setting. So there are two main broad generations of protocols, let's say in this setting. The first basically asks what kind of primitives and protocols can we construct in the network agnostic setting. So we deal with things like BA, MPC. The next one more focuses on performance. So like given that we now know we can do a lot of things, what kind of performance can we achieve? And we see our work more aligned with this latter generation. And then in distributed key generation, it's been very active in the last few years. I think quite early work would essentially abstract away the distributed computing portion of the protocol, but recently researchers have looked at sort of in the synchronous and asynchronous models what kind of performance one can get without, say, a trusted broadcast channel. Good. So let's work towards constructing our protocol. So I have first introduced synchronous broadcast. So what is synchronous broadcast? Well, we have n parties as before. We have a leader, and the leader wants to broadcast a message to all parties. So natural enough. So the properties we want here are firstly, we want validity. So if that party is honest, then all parties will output the same message, or at least honest parties, because of course we cannot say what the dishonest parties do. If the leader is dishonest, then we can't say anything about this. But we can still want to enforce that that all parties output the same message. So for example, if the leader is dishonest and does nothing, then it's possible for all parties to output like a bot or a default message. But in general, we want parties to agree on this. And finally, we want the parties all terminate the protocol at some point with some output. Good. So a one-slide summary of what we do for broadcast in this setting. So basically, we combine sort of recent advances in broadcast together to get our desired communication complexity. So there's been recent work that looked at sort of gossiping in sort of the binary message case. And the basic idea here is that it can be cheaper to sort of do broadcast even over a synchronous network, even when you assume still a dishonest majority of parties, than not. So the idea basically is that if you're one party that sends a message, you want to send a message to a security parameter many sort of parties, and except a negligible probability, because the adversary is static, one honest party will receive that message with high probability, or with except a negligible probability. So essentially, when we show, one can show that sort of the message will propagate more and more in the network, and after a logarithmic number of rounds, all parties will receive the message. And if you're in certain scenarios, this can be cheaper than doing all-to-all broadcast. And then we also use extension protocol techniques that basically use stuff like erasure codes and accumulators and such. Good. And now moving more to the asynchronous portion of our protocol, we look at intrusion-tolerant consensus. So in consensus, binary agreement, now we have all parties inputting a message, and then they want to output some message or agree on the message. So in our protocol, the main problem here is that the message could come from a dishonest party. And so to solve this, one can look at a nice notion called intrusion-tolerant consensus. So the guarantee here for intrusion tolerance is that an honest party either will output an honest party's input or some bottom message. So the properties we want is sort of a validity property, a consistency property, a liveness property. And sort of the protocol we construct is based on an asynchronous protocol from Mostafa and Reynal, adapted to this network agnostic setting. And the difference here is that we deal with sort of an extended validity property when the network is synchronous. So if the number of faults is higher than the asynchronous threshold in general, we can still ensure like validity. And this is useful for constructing our protocol. And then in the sort of plain PKR model, we get cubic complexity, which is enough for our protocol, as we'll see. Good. So let's look at the protocol. So the protocol consists of two main parts, the synchronous and asynchronous part. And the goal here is for parties to agree, firstly, on sort of TS+1 or more PVSS sharings or verifiable secret sharings, so they can then jointly combine these together to compute secrets such that at least one of the parties was honest, so you have a uniform secret. And I won't go into the details of VSS, but basically a VSS scheme basically corresponds to a single party sort of acting as a dealer sharing, as we saw in the previous talk. So in our protocol, firstly, what happens is all parties will do a synchronous broadcast of this sort of linear-sized PVSS sharing. At the end sort of this broadcast, in parallel, all parties will output something. And so what those parties will do is input all of this stuff into the intrusion-tolerant consensus. So in the synchronous case, all these the output of this broadcast will be the same for all parties. So then because we have this extended validity property, all parties will agree on the output, and then they can reconstruct the secret. Or they can reconstruct public material that finishes the protocol, I should say. But in asynchrony, in general, because all parties may propose different things, the intrusion-tolerant consensus may return a bottom value. But then in this case, we know we're definitely in asynchrony. So then we can simply fall back to an existing protocol. For example, yeah, the one we saw before, or any of the ones in the literature. So here's a very high-level overview of the protocol. We have this PVSS step at the beginning, where all parties synchronously broadcast. They then end up with a different sort of view, a possibly different view of the network's asynchronous, of sort of the output, the outcome of that, and then they do intrusion-tolerant consensus. And then they either sort of finish the protocol or fall back to the asynchronous DKG. Good. Just two quick notes here. So firstly, running our intrusion-tolerant consensus protocol with the output of the sharings alone is going to be too expensive. So what we do instead is we basically, parties will accumulate these sort of n PVSS sharings into some value. In fact, we accumulate values that are sort of personalized for each party such that they can then do the reconstruction after this finishes. And so if the intrusion-tolerant consensus outputs a non-bottom value, there must have been some honest proposer by the intrusion tolerance that can basically forward the relevant values to these other parties to finish the protocol. And finally, we note in asynchrony, synchronous broadcast can result in sort of arbitrary disagreement in asynchrony. So the idea here is that parties will only run the intrusion tolerant consensus with non-bottom input if they receive enough valid PVSS sharings. Otherwise, they just put return bot, and then they can run, they can fall back to ADKG if they need to. Good. So just to quickly look at MPC for a little bit. So our distributed key generation protocol, firstly, can be used to bootstrap sort of existing network agnostic MPC protocols, or a subset of these protocols without trusted setup, in particular, the BLL20 protocol that relies on sort of threshold additively homomorphic encryption, public encryption. In a second step in this paper, what we also do is we improve the complexity of that paper. So the guarantee that we can get is that either we improve the sort of the communication complexity of that protocol by a linear factor in n, or we go from basically trusted setup to the plain PKI setting for free, depending on what assumptions we use for a specific primitive in this construction. And so what we get is that we get a quadratic complexity per multiplication gate with the trusted setup, which matches the asynchronous state of the art. So quickly to look at this protocol, it consists again of two parts, a synchronous and then an asynchronous part. So if the synchronous part fails, it goes to the asynchronous protocol. So then we know how to do that from previous work. But then the synchronous part, we look at in more detail. So to briefly summarize what this BLL20 protocol does is basically compute some circuit, sort of like parties will sort of compute the circuit gate by gate using a threshold homomorphic encryption. But then the real bottleneck in this protocol is this sort of computing these multiplication gates. And in the construction, each of these gates requires using n network agnostic binary Byzantine agreement parameters per gate, which ends up with a larger complexity than we would like. So to resolve this, basically what we do is instead using fairly well-known techniques. What we do is we instead sort of do an offline-online kind of amortization, where firstly parties will sort of set up enough beaver triples, basically, and then what they will do is run binary Byzantine agreement on sort of which parties to basically use in order to then sort of like actually compute those beaver triples with those parties, like which indices of the parties to basically compute the beaver triples with. And so there, in particular, that the number of BA instances is now independent of the number of multiplication gates in the circuit. Yeah, except I guess the main takeaway here is we slightly adapt like existing protocols to the network agnostic setting to make this work. Good. So to conclude, we obtained network agnostic DKG almost for free. So there are some caveats. Firstly, we have a linear round complexity, principally due to our use of the Dolov-Strong-like protocol. So the question is, can we maintain the round complexity, the communication complexity, and also reduce the round complexity? And a second question, very interesting question, is can we look at adaptive securities? And there are a few technical barriers here that it's interesting to look at. And more generally in the network agnostic setting, seeing how these having protocols that sort of perform as well as sort of non-network agnostic protocols will be very nice to see in practice. And with that, I'll finish up. So thanks.
Thank you. So we have quite a lot of time for questions. So anybody have a question? Okay, let me start actually then.
Nice.
I know it's my own paper, but
this was not planned.
Okay, so do you have any idea how to do this? Like you mentioned that for the broadcast module, right? Like it might be difficult to get something that runs in better round complexity. So if you take, you know, advantage of the fact that we're doing honest majority anyway here. Like what would the protocol of choice be to take into this area and to get something network agnostic?
Yeah. So I guess in general, if you have a network agnostic, if you have a synchronous protocol and you want to adapt it to the network agnostic setting, you have to kind of look at the details of the protocol. But I know firstly it's possible to, I imagine it is possible to design a protocol that basically has qubit complexity for broadcasting and sufficiently large messages. Another direction, there's recent work, DIS 2020 on sort of early stopping dishonest majority protocols, which could also be a direction to look at as well. But I think I'm not sure which exact work would be best to look at, but I think it's doable. I think at least especially with static security, I think it should be doable.
So you think you can get expected constant round complexity for the entire protocol? Okay.
That would, yeah, I would assume so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so any other questions? Okay, then let's thank the speaker again. We'll take a short 5-minute break for the track switch.